My name is Diane Whitfield Marsh. I am 46 years old, and I have been a United States federal judge for 6 years, and my own mother has never once asked me what I do for a living. My sister hit a man with her car on a wet road outside a bar in Blue Ash, Ohio, and left him bleeding on the shoulder while she drove home and washed her tires with a garden hose. By the time this story ends, my sister will be sentenced in a federal courtroom by another judge's hand, not mine, because I stepped away from her case the moment I understood what it was, and my mother will still have no idea what I actually do until the day a letter arrives at her house, written in my own hand with my father's old fountain pen, telling her the truth for the first time in 39 years. I did not plan it that way. I want to say that clearly before I go any further, because people hear a story like this and assume there was a strategy from the beginning, some long game I was playing against my own family. There wasn't. There was only a pattern of quiet that started so long ago I stopped noticing it, the way you stop noticing a hum in a house until the power goes out and the silence after is louder than the hum ever was. I am telling you this from my chambers on the 4th floor of the Potter Stewart United States Courthouse in downtown Cincinnati, a building with limestone the color of wet sand and windows that look out over the Ohio River toward Kentucky. It is a Tuesday evening in October, and the courthouse has mostly emptied out. My clerk left an hour ago. There is a cold cup of coffee on the corner of my desk that I have not touched since 2, and there is a fountain pen sitting in a wooden tray beside my laptop, a black lacquer Waterman with a gold nib, worn smooth on one side from 40 years of somebody's thumb. It was my father's. He gave it to me the day I got my acceptance letter to law school, and he did not say anything sentimental when he handed it to me. He just said, "You write your name with this from now on," and set it on the kitchen table like it was nothing, like it was a set of car keys. I want to go backward before I go forward, because that is the only way this story makes sense. I grew up in a split-level house on Kenwood Road in a suburb east of Cincinnati, in a family where my sister Kaylee was the sun and everyone else, including our father while he was alive, orbited around whatever she needed that week. Kaylee is 4 years younger than me. She was the pretty one, the funny one, the one who could talk her way out of a speeding ticket by crying at the right moment, and I do not say that with bitterness. I say it because it is a fact I cataloged early, the way you catalog the weather. My mother, Carol Whitfield, built her entire identity around protecting Kaylee from consequence. Not loving her, protecting her from consequence, which is a different thing, though my mother never seemed to understand the difference. I was the responsible one. That is the label I got handed in 3rd grade and never got to put down. Responsible meant invisible. Responsible meant nobody asked how my day was because responsible people are assumed to be fine. When I got into Ohio State on a full academic scholarship, my mother mentioned it once at Thanksgiving and then spent 20 minutes describing how proud she was that Kaylee had made the cheerleading squad despite, in her words, not being naturally athletic. When I passed the bar exam on my first attempt, my mother sent a single text that said "Good job, hun," and then called me 40 minutes later in tears because Kaylee had failed her cosmetology license exam and needed comforting. There is one memory from that childhood I want to give you in full because it explains more than a summary ever could. I was 11, Kaylee was 7, and our father took us both to the county fair in Lebanon, Ohio, one Saturday in August. Kaylee wanted to ride the Ferris wheel and got scared halfway up and started crying, and our father spent 45 minutes afterward walking her around the midway, buying her lemonade, letting her pick out a stuffed elephant from a ring toss booth, $3 a try, $6 total before he finally won it for her. I had wanted, that whole day, to show him a blue ribbon I had won that morning in the 4-H tent for a wood carving project I had spent 2 months on, a small owl I had sanded and stained myself. I held onto it in my coat pocket the entire time we walked the midway, waiting for a moment that did not come, and when we finally got back to the car that evening, my mother asked Kaylee 3 separate times if she felt better, and never once asked me what was in my pocket. I did not take it out. I put it on my dresser when we got home, and nobody in my family ever saw it, and in time it went into a box in the attic, and it is still there, as far as I know, a small stained owl nobody in my family ever asked to see. I do not tell you this to complain about my childhood. I tell you this because it explains why, when I was appointed to the federal bench by the president in 2018, confirmed by the Senate in the spring of 2019, and sworn in that June in a small ceremony with my husband Tom and our 2 sons standing behind me, I did not tell my mother what the job actually was. I told her I got a promotion. I told her I work for the federal government now, doing legal work. She said, "That's nice, hun. Is that anything like what your cousin Brenda does at the post office?" And I said something close enough, and I let it go, because by that point in my life I had learned that correcting my mother about anything related to my career cost more than it was worth. It would become, within 4 sentences, a story about Kaylee's new job at the salon and how brave she was for starting over at 35. So I stopped correcting her. I let her believe I did paperwork. I let 13 years of law school, of clerking for a 6th Circuit judge, of 6 years as a federal prosecutor, of a partnership at a firm on 4th Street, of a presidential appointment, collapse into paperwork, because paperwork did not require an argument, and I did not have the energy left for arguments with my mother by the time I was 40 years old. My husband thought it was strange. He still does. Tom is an architect, calm by nature, the kind of man who asks a question once and then waits as long as it takes for the real answer. He asked me on our 10th anniversary, over dinner at a restaurant on Vine Street, why I never told my own mother what I actually do. I remember exactly what I said, because I had said it to myself so many times it had worn a groove. I said, because the day I tell her, it stops being mine. She will find a way to make it about Kaylee, or she will find a way to make it small, and either way I lose something I have kept for myself my whole life. Tom did not argue with me. He just reached across the table and held my hand for a second, the way he does when he thinks I am wrong but loves me anyway. So that is where things stood in July of this year. My mother believed I did legal paperwork somewhere downtown. My sister Kaylee, 39 years old, twice divorced, working part-time at a salon in Montgomery, and living in an apartment my mother helped pay the deposit on, believed the same thing when she believed anything about me at all. Then, on a Friday night in the middle of July, Kaylee left a bar called the Rookwood on Montgomery Road just after 11 at night, got into her white Ford Escape, and drove 5 blocks before she drifted across the center line on a curve near the intersection with Cooper Road, and struck a man named Elias Gutierrez, who was walking home from a shift at a restaurant because his own car was in the shop. She did not stop. Traffic camera footage later showed her taillights disappearing around the curve, while Elias Gutierrez lay on the wet asphalt with a shattered pelvis and a fractured skull, and a woman named Denise Acaffer, who had been 2 cars behind Kaylee and saw the whole thing happen, pulled over, called 911, and stayed with him until the ambulance came, and gave a description of the vehicle, and did not, in that moment, say a single word to Kaylee, who by then was 3 streets away with her hands shaking on the wheel. I want to pause here on Denise Acaffer because she matters to this story more than she will ever know. She saw everything. She saw the car swerve, she saw the moment of impact, she saw the taillights leave. And she said nothing to anyone in my family, not that night, not for the 6 weeks that followed, because she had no idea who Kaylee was, no idea there was a family connected to that white Escape at all. She simply did what a decent person does. She stayed. She called. She gave her statement to the responding officer, a young man from the Blue Ash Police Department named Officer Talbot, and then she went home, and according to the statement she later gave under oath, she did not sleep that night, replaying the sound the car made. Denise Acaffer would tell an investigator, months later, in a statement I read for the first time in the discovery file long after everything was over, that the sound was not what she expected. She had always thought, if she ever witnessed something like that, the impact would be loud, cinematic, but she said it was almost soft, a single dull note, like a car door closing too hard, and it was the softness of it that haunted her more than anything else, because a sound that small should not have been able to break a person the way it broke Elias Gutierrez. She kept driving her usual route past that intersection for weeks afterward, she said, unable to explain to herself why, until finally she started taking Kenwood Road instead, 3 minutes longer, just to avoid the curve near Cooper Road entirely. Kaylee drove home. She parked in her apartment complex's lot. According to what came out much later, she sat in the car for 11 minutes before going inside, and she did not call anyone that night, not our mother, not me, not a lawyer. She went to bed. In the morning, she rinsed the dried blood off the front bumper of the Escape with a garden hose behind her apartment building, and a neighbor 2 units down, a retired postal worker named Harold Prout, watched her do it from his kitchen window while he made coffee, and he also said nothing, because he assumed it was mud from the rain the night before. And it was not until 3 days later, when the local news ran a story asking for information about a hit and run on Cooper Road, that Harold Prout put the pieces together and called the number on the screen. I did not know any of this yet. On that Friday night, I was at home in Hyde Park, asleep beside my husband, having spent the evening reading a stack of sentencing memoranda for a drug conspiracy case I had on my docket the following week. I want you to sit with that detail for a moment, because it becomes important later. While my sister was driving away from a man bleeding on the pavement, I was reading about consequences for a living in the next county over, and neither of us knew the other existed in that sentence. My mother called me on a Sunday afternoon, 2 days later. I remember I was in the garden pulling weeds along the fence line, and I had dirt under my fingernails when I answered, and my mother's voice had a particular pitch to it that I had heard exactly twice before in my life, once when my father had his first heart attack, and once when Kaylee got arrested for a DUI in 2015. It is a pitch that means something has happened that she cannot immediately spin into a story about how brave Kaylee is being. She said, "Diane, I need you to come over. Something happened with your sister, and I need you to help me figure out what to do." I did not ask what happened on the phone. My mother does not give information easily. She gives it in installments designed to control your reaction. So I told her I would be there in 20 minutes, and I drove to the house on Kenwood Road with dirt still under my nails. And when I walked in, my mother was sitting at the kitchen table with Kaylee, and Kaylee's eyes were red and swollen, and there was a legal pad on the table with my mother's handwriting on it, bullet points, the way she takes notes when she's trying to manage a crisis like a project. My mother said Kaylee was in an accident Friday night. A man got hurt. It's being called a hit and run on the news, but that's not what happened. She just panicked, and now the police are asking questions, and we need a plan before Monday. I sat down. I did not say anything yet. That is a habit of mine, one I built over years on the bench before I was ever on the bench, sitting still while people filled the silence with more than they meant to give away. My mother filled it. She told me that a witness had come forward, that the police had Kaylee's plate number from a partial match on a traffic camera and Harold Prout's tip, that they were going to want to talk to her, and that my mother had already decided on her own, in the 2 days since it happened, what the story was going to be. She looked at me and she said, "Here's what we're going to say. You were driving that night. You'd had a glass of wine at dinner and you were the one behind the wheel, and Kaylee wasn't even in the car, she was home with me. You have a good job, you have a clean record, you can afford whatever comes of it, and Kaylee cannot survive this right now, not after everything with her divorce and the custody thing with Ethan. You've always been the strong one. This is what strong means." I want to tell you exactly what happened in my body in that moment, because it is the truest thing I can tell you about this whole story. My stomach did not drop. It went cold and flat, like a table had been wiped clean underneath it. My hands, which had been resting on the kitchen table, went still in a way that felt deliberate even though I had not decided to make them still. And somewhere behind my sternum, a door that had been open a crack for 40 years, a door I did not even know I had been holding open my entire life waiting for her to walk through it and finally see me, that door closed. Quietly, without a sound. I remember thinking in the exact words, "So this is it. This is the whole answer. 46 years and this is the whole answer." I did not raise my voice. I want to be honest that some part of me wanted to. But I have spent 20 years learning that the moment you raise your voice, you become the story, and I did not want to become the story. I said, "Mom, a man is in the hospital. Do you know how badly he's hurt?" My mother waved her hand like I had asked something irrelevant. She said, "He's going to be fine. These things happen. It's an accident. We're not talking about whether it happened. We're talking about who takes the fall for it. And Diane, you can afford to take the fall for it. You have savings. You have a good job." Kaylee has nothing left. If this follows her, she loses everything. She loses Ethan for good. Kaylee had not said a word this entire time. She sat with her arms wrapped around herself, staring at the legal pad, and when she finally spoke, her voice was small in a way I had not heard since we were children. She said, "Diane, please, I can't do this again." I looked at my sister, and I felt something I want to describe honestly, because it was not simple. I felt the old reflex, the one built over decades, the instinct to fix it for her, to smooth it over, the same reflex that had made me do her book report in 8th grade and cover her shift at the pool the summer she wanted to go to a concert instead. That reflex is strong. It does not go away just because you are 46 years old and sit on a federal bench. But underneath it, for the first time in my life, there was something else. A stillness. A clarity, the kind I get in a courtroom when a case that looked complicated on paper suddenly resolves into a single, obvious fact. The fact was this. A man named Elias Gutierrez was lying in a hospital bed with a fractured skull because my sister left him on the road, and my mother wanted me to lie to a federal investigation to protect her from the consequences of that, and had been ready to ask this of me before she had even asked how the man was doing. I said, "I need to think." I got up from the table, and I want you to understand what that cost me, because my whole life I had never once gotten up from a table my mother set without giving her what she wanted first. I drove home. I did not cry in the car. I gripped the wheel at 10 and 2 the entire way, and I noticed, distantly, that my knuckles had gone white, and I thought, so that is what this feels like. This thing I have watched 100 defendants feel in my courtroom, the moment before the moment. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories. This is where we share real-life inspired tales of family conflict, betrayal, and the quiet strength it takes to stand your ground. If these stories speak to you, drop a comment and be sure to subscribe. I did not answer my mother that night. I did not answer her the next day either. On Monday morning, I drove downtown, and instead of going up to my chambers, I called an old colleague, a man named Robert Fenwick, who I had clerked alongside 15 years earlier, and who was now a supervising assistant United States attorney with a specialty in traffic fatality and hit and run cases that crossed into federal jurisdiction because of the interstate proximity or the involved parties. I did not tell him I was calling about my sister. I told him I needed to understand, hypothetically, what happens procedurally when a hit and run victim's injuries are severe enough and a witness has come forward with a partial plate match. He walked me through it without asking why I wanted to know, because that is a professional courtesy we extend to each other, the assumption that a judge asking a hypothetical question has a judge's reasons. He told me that Blue Ash PD would have already pulled traffic camera footage from the intersection and nearby businesses, that with a partial plate and Harold Prute's tip about the hose, they likely already had Kaylee's name, and that it was a matter of days, not weeks, before they came to her door. He told me that if she came forward voluntarily before they did, it would matter at sentencing. He told me that if someone else took the fall for her and it later came out, and it always came out, the obstruction charge alone could be worse than the original offense. I thanked him. I did not tell him who it was about. I sat in my car in the courthouse garage for 11 minutes after that call, the same 11 minutes, though I did not know it at the time, that Kaylee had sat in her own car 3 days earlier, and I did the thing I do best. I cataloged. I want to walk you through what I cataloged, because this is the part of me that people who know me at work would recognize and the part of me my family never once saw. I did not think about revenge. I did not think about finally being seen. I thought about Elias Gutierrez, 31 years old, a line cook at a restaurant on Montgomery Road, in intensive care with a fractured skull and a shattered pelvis. A man with, I would later learn, $61,500 in medical bills already accruing in his first 10 days. A man with a mother in Guatemala he had been sending money home to every month. A man whose entire life had been altered on a wet curve because my sister had 4 drinks and did not want to call a cab. I thought about the fact that my mother's first instinct, upon learning this, was not to ask if he would survive. It was to ask who would take the fall. I drove back to the house on Kenwood Road that evening. My mother opened the door already talking, already 3 sentences into an argument I had not agreed to have, saying she'd been thinking it through, and the story just needed a few more details to make it airtight, that maybe I could say I swerved to avoid a deer, that deer stories always worked because everyone in this county had a deer story of their own. I stood in the doorway and did not come inside. I said, "Mom, I'm not doing that." She said, "Diane, you don't understand what's at stake here." I said, "I understand exactly what's at stake. A man is in the ICU, and you're asking me to commit a federal crime to keep your other daughter from facing consequences for leaving him there." My mother's face did something I had seen before, a specific tightening around the mouth that meant she was recalculating, looking for the next angle. She said, "This isn't about you being some kind of hero, Diane. This is about family. This is about protecting your sister the way I have always protected both of you." I said, "You have never once protected me. You have protected her from me and from the world and from herself for 39 years, and I let you because it was easier than fighting you for a place at your own table. But I am not lying to a federal investigation. That's not a values statement, Mom. That's the law." I know the law. It is my job to know the law. My mother said, "Your job is paperwork, Diane. Don't be dramatic." I remember standing very still in that doorway. I remember the exact weight of the moment, the temptation, right there, to say it, to say I am a federal judge. I have sentenced men for exactly this. I know precisely what happens to people who ask other people to lie for them in an active investigation. Say it and watch her face change. I did not say it. Some things you do not hand to a person who has never once asked to see them honestly. I turned and walked back to my car, and behind me I heard Kaylee's voice, thin, calling my name once, and I did not turn around. Tell me in the comments, have you ever had to choose between protecting your family's secrets and doing what you knew was right? I read every single one, and if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the time, because what happens next is the part I've been building toward this whole time. Detective work moves faster than families expect, and slower than television makes it look. On the following Wednesday, 6 days after the accident, 2 detectives from the Blue Ash Police Department, working alongside a Hamilton County Sheriff's investigator, because the case had been flagged for potential federal interest due to the severity of injury and a preliminary indication that Gutierrez's employer operated across state lines in a way that touched interstate commerce statutes, arrived at Kaylee's apartment with a warrant to examine her vehicle. I was not there. I learned the details later in pieces, first from my mother in a panicked phone call, and later, far more precisely, from the discovery documents once the case moved into the system I worked inside every day. Though I recused myself from any involvement in the case itself the moment I understood what it was, filing the paperwork quietly through the clerk's office and requesting it be assigned outside my docket entirely, a fact almost no one at the courthouse thought twice about. Because judges recuse themselves from cases with personal connections all the time, and nobody there had any reason to know Kaylee Whitfield was my sister. Because on paper, after her second divorce, her legal name was Kaylee Reyes. Kaylee described the search to me only once, months later, over coffee, and I have never forgotten the way she told it, in small pieces, out of order, the way people describe the worst moments of their lives. She said the detectives knocked at 9 in the morning, and she was still in her robe, and one of them, a woman, stood in the doorway of her bedroom while the other walked out to the parking lot with a camera and a small kit. And Kaylee said she stood at her kitchen window watching them examine the wheel well of the Escape for what felt like an hour but was probably 10 minutes. And at some point, one of them crouched down with a swab and held it up to the light, and Kaylee said she knew, in that exact second, before anyone said a single word to her, that it was over because of the way the detective's shoulders changed, a small settling, the posture of someone whose question has just been answered. She said she went back into the apartment and sat on the edge of her bed and waited, and she did not cry, and she did not call anyone. She just sat there counting the seconds until they knocked on the door again, this time with the words she had known were coming since the wheel well. The detectives found blood residue in the wheel well of the escape that the garden hose had not fully reached. They found paint transfer consistent with Elias Gutierrez's jacket. They had Harold Prute's statement about the hose. They had Denise Aucaffer's statement about the swerve and the taillights. Kaylee was arrested that afternoon and charged initially at the state level with failure to stop after an accident and vehicular assault. And because the man she struck worked for an employer whose supply chain crossed state lines in a manner the U.S. Attorney's Office determined triggered federal interest, under a theory involving obstruction of interstate commerce through witness tampering that emerged later. Once my mother's phone calls entered the picture, the case was later elevated, in part, into federal jurisdiction, which is the part of this story I want to slow down on, because it is the part where the two halves of my life, the daughter and the judge, finally touched each other. Kaylee's arraignment took place at the Hamilton County Courthouse on Main Street, and I did not attend it, though my mother described it to me afterward in a phone call thick with outrage. How they had made Kaylee stand at a podium in an orange jumpsuit like a common criminal. How the whole thing had taken 11 minutes and felt, in my mother's words, like a machine that did not care who anybody was. I remember thinking, while she talked, that this was precisely correct. The system was not supposed to care who anybody was. That was the entire architecture of it. The same architecture I upheld 5 days a week in a courtroom 11 miles from where my sister had stood in that jumpsuit. And I did not say that to my mother either. Bail was set at $25,000, secured through a bond my mother arranged with Patty Osterman's husband. And Kaylee was released the same evening with an ankle monitor and a court date. And it was in the 6 weeks between that arraignment and the later federal elevation of the case that my mother made the phone call to Patty that would end up on a wiretap transcript months later. Here is what my mother did, and I did not know she had done it until it appeared in a wiretap transcript months later. 2 days after Kaylee's arrest, believing she still had control of the narrative, my mother called a friend of hers, a woman named Patty Osterman whose husband worked as a bail bondsman, and asked Patty if she knew a lawyer who could, in my mother's words on that call, help make this go away quietly, maybe find a way to make the witness less certain about what she saw. My mother did not understand, and I do not think fully understands even now, that a call like that made about an active federal witness is itself a crime. Patty, uncomfortable with the request, mentioned it in passing to her husband, who mentioned it to a detective he knew socially, who flagged it. And from that flag came a wiretap warrant on my mother's phone, approved by a magistrate judge 2 floors below my own chambers. A judge I have known for 11 years and who had absolutely no idea, when he signed that warrant, that the Carol Whitfield on the affidavit was my mother. I found out about the wiretap the way I found out most of what happened in this case, secondhand, weeks later, in a phone call from Robert Fenwick, who by then knew exactly who I was in relation to this case because I had finally told him, sitting across from him in his office on a Thursday afternoon, closing his door first, and saying, "Robert, I need to tell you something before this goes any further, and you need to decide whether you can still talk to me about it." I told him Kaylee Reyes was my sister. I told him I had recused myself from any judicial role in the matter and would continue to have no role in it whatsoever. I told him that my mother had asked me to falsely confess to the crime and that I had refused, and that I wanted him to know that so there was never a question later about where I stood. Robert sat back in his chair for a long moment, turning a pen over in his fingers, the small physical habit he has always had when he is deciding how much to say. He said, "Diane, I've known you 15 years. I did not need you to tell me any of that for me to know how you'd handle it, but I appreciate you telling me anyway." I asked him then what he thought would happen to her, and he was careful with his answer, the way good prosecutors are careful, not promising an outcome, only describing a range. He told me the video and the witness statements alone would likely be enough for a strong case, even without anything from my mother, that the injury severity put this well outside the range of a probationary sentence, and that the only real variable left was whether Kaylee cooperated early or made the office build the whole case the hard way. because cooperation, even now, even this late, would matter at the end. He asked me gently whether I intended to have any contact with her about the case at all, and I told him no, none, and he nodded and said, "Good, keep it that way for her sake and yours both, because the worst thing that could happen to this case, worse than a stiff sentence, would be a defense attorney somewhere down the line discovering that a federal judge had been coaching the defendant from the sidelines, even with good intentions." I told him I understood that better than almost anyone in the building. Before I left his office that afternoon, he asked me one more question, not as a prosecutor but as a friend. He said, "Off the record, Diane, are you all right?" And I remember the question caught me strangely off guard, because so few people in my life had asked it directly in years, and I told him the truth, which was, "I don't know yet," and he nodded like that was an acceptable answer, which it was. I want to describe what it felt like to say those words out loud to another human being for the first time, because it is the closest this story comes to a solo reflection, and I have had very few of those, because I did not let myself have them, not really, not until that office, that door closed, that late afternoon light coming through the blinds in stripes across his desk. I sat there after I finished talking, and I felt my shoulders come down, actually physically come down, maybe 2 inches, and I realized in that exact moment how long I had been holding them up, not for weeks, but for years, decades, holding them at that height since I was maybe 9 years old, and understood for the first time that in my family, being fine was a job, and I had been doing that job without a single day off for 37 years. I drove home that night along Columbia Parkway with the river on my right, catching the last orange light of the evening, and I did not turn the radio on. I let myself think about my father, about the fountain pen, about the one time in my whole childhood he had pulled me aside, in the garage, while my mother was inside dealing with some crisis of Kaylee's, a broken curfew or a failed test, and he had said to me quietly, "Not everyone gets to see what you're made of, Diane, and that's all right, because you know." I had not thought about that memory in 15 years. I thought about it that entire drive home. The case against Kaylee moved forward through the fall. I stayed away from it entirely in any official capacity, a fact I want to be precise about because it matters both legally and morally. I never touched a single filing. I never spoke to the prosecutor about strategy. I never spoke to the defense attorney my mother later hired for Kaylee, a competent, unremarkable man named Gerald Voss, who charged my mother $42,000 in retainer fees over the following months. Money my mother took out of a home equity line of credit on the house on Kenwood Road without telling anyone how she was paying for it, which I only learned when Kaylee mentioned it, bitterly, during one of the last conversations we had before everything came apart in the way it finally did. That conversation happened in September, at a coffee shop on Madison Road. The two of us alone together for the first time since the accident, months before Thanksgiving would bring the whole family back into one room, because Kaylee had called me directly, which she almost never did, and asked if we could talk without our mother there. She was thinner than I remembered from July, and she kept turning her coffee cup a quarter turn every few seconds while she talked, a small nervous motion I recognized because I had watched her do a version of it since she was a child, spinning the salt shaker at family dinners whenever she was in trouble. She told me Gerald Voss kept telling her the case did not look good, that the witness statements were solid, that the video was solid, and that her best option was likely a plea rather than a trial. She said Mom keeps telling him to fight it, keeps telling him there has to be some technicality, some way out, and she looked up at me and said, "Do you think there's a way out, Diane?" And I felt my jaw tighten before I answered. I said, "Kaylee, I can't advise you on your case. You know that. I recused myself the day I found out, and I have to stay that way, for your sake as much as mine. Do you understand that?" She turned the cup another quarter turn and said, quietly, "I understand you won't help me." I said, "That's not what I said." I said, in the silence that followed, in my own head, the thought I did not speak out loud, which was, "You left a man bleeding on the road and washed your bumper with a garden hose before you called anyone, including me, and now you are asking your sister to find you a technicality." I did not say that. I reached across the table instead and put my hand over hers, stilling the cup, and I said, "I think you should tell Gerald the truth, all of it, and let him do his job honestly, Because a technicality built on people not knowing who I am is not a way out, Kaylee. It's a trap, and it will close on you harder later." She did not answer. She looked down at the table, and I paid for both coffees, and we did not talk again until Thanksgiving. My mother called me periodically that fall, less frequently as the months went on, each call some variation of an argument for why I should intervene, why my position, whatever she thought my position actually was, could help Kaylee. I always said the same thing. I am not involved in this case. I cannot be involved in this case. Each time, she heard it as me being cold, being difficult, choosing my career over my sister, and each time I let her believe that, because the alternative, telling her the actual reason recusal existed, telling her what I actually was, still felt like handing her something she had never once earned the right to hold. There's a scene from that fall I want to give you in full, because it is the one silence I regret least and understand most. In November, my mother invited me to Thanksgiving at the house on Kenwood Road, the first family gathering since the accident, and I almost did not go. Tom told me I should, that avoiding it would only give my mother more material for the story she was already telling herself, the story where I had abandoned the family in its hour of need. So I went. I drove to Kenwood Road that Thursday morning with a green bean casserole balanced on the passenger seat, the same dish I had brought to that house every Thanksgiving since I was 23 years old, because it was expected of me, and I had never once tried to break the expectation. My mother opened the door in an apron I remembered from childhood, faded now, the strings tied twice around her waist because she had lost weight over the fall, and she hugged me the way she always hugged me, a brief press of her cheek against mine, already turning away before the hug finished to check something in the oven. Kaylee was there, out on bond, thinner than I remembered, quieter. My mother had set the table with the good china, the same china she had used every Thanksgiving of my childhood, and at one point, over the turkey, with my sons and Tom at the table, my mother turned to the other guests, an aunt and uncle from Dayton, and said, "You know Diane does legal work downtown. She's very modest about it. And Kaylee, our brave girl, is going through such a difficult legal situation right now. False accusations mostly. We're getting through it as a family." I sat there with a forkful of stuffing halfway to my mouth. Inside my head, the exact thought I had, word for word, was, she is still doing it. Even now. Even with a man in a hospital bed with a plate in his skull, she is still managing the narrative like a campaign. I did not say that. I set my fork down instead, quietly, and I looked at Kaylee across the table, and Kaylee looked back at me, and for one second, one single second, something passed between us that had never passed between us before, a flicker of recognition, of shared understanding about the woman sitting at the head of the table, and then Kaylee looked away, back down at her plate, and the moment closed. I did not correct my mother about the paperwork comment. I let it sit there on the table between the cranberry sauce and the good china, another small lie I allowed to stand because correcting it, in that room, in that moment, would have cost more than it was worth. And I had, by then, become very good at making that calculation quickly and without apparent effort, the way you become good at anything you have had 46 years of practice doing. Later that afternoon, while the aunt and uncle from Dayton were out on the back deck smoking, and my sons were watching football in the den, my mother caught me alone in the kitchen while I was wrapping leftovers, and she said, without looking up from the dish she was drying, "Diane, you've been very quiet with your sister today. Don't you think she needs your support right now more than ever?" I set down the foil I was holding and said, "Mom, I have shown up. I drove here. I brought the casserole I bring every year." I'm not required to perform enthusiasm about this on top of it. My mother's hands stilled on the dish towel for a moment, a small gesture I noticed the way I notice small gestures in a witness on the stand, and she said, "You have always made things so difficult, Deanne. This is your sister." And I felt that old door behind my sternum, the one that had closed back in July, hold firm, not reopen. And I said, "I know she's my sister. I have known that longer than you've known what I do for a living." My mother did not have an answer for that. She went back to drying the dish, and I finished wrapping the leftovers, and we did not speak again until I said goodbye at the door 2 hours later. Kaylee did in the end take a plea in January to failure to stop after an accident resulting in serious bodily injury under the applicable federal statute, along with a related count tied to the obstruction concerns that had grown out of my mother's call to Patty Osterman, a count her own attorney negotiated down considerably given that my mother herself had never taken any action beyond the single phone call. Gerald Voss argued for leniency based on Kaylee's lack of prior felony record, her ongoing custody arrangement with her son Ethan, and what he described in his sentencing memorandum as a profound and demonstrated remorse. I read that memorandum once, much later, sitting alone in my kitchen with a glass of wine I did not finish, and I found myself circling one line in particular, a line where Voss wrote that the defendant had been raised in an environment that consistently shielded her from the natural consequences of her actions. And I sat with that sentence for a long time, because it was, in its clinical legal language, the truest thing anyone connected to this case had said about my family. And it had been written by a stranger who had known us for 6 months, not by anyone who had lived inside it for 40 years. The trial itself, once it came, moved in the way federal cases move, methodically, without drama, across a series of pretrial hearings through the winter and into the following spring. I want to be honest that I do not know every detail of those proceedings firsthand, because I kept the wall between myself and the case as high as I had built it the day I recused, and I have reconstructed much of it since from the public record, and from what Robert told me once it was over, and there was no longer any reason for either of us to hold back. The evidence against Kaylee was, in the end, not close. Denise Aucaffer testified about what she saw that night, the swerve, the impact, the taillights disappearing. Harold Prout testified about the garden hose. The traffic camera footage, enhanced by a forensic video analyst, showed the plate clearly enough to remove any doubt. And the wiretap of my mother's call to Patty Osterman, the one requesting help making the witness less certain, became, once it was entered as evidence in a pretrial hearing regarding potential witness tampering, the single most damaging piece of the entire case, because it demonstrated, in my mother's own recorded voice, and consciousness of guilt that went well beyond the accident itself and reached into an attempt to obstruct the investigation. My mother was not criminally charged. The call fell short of what prosecutors needed to bring an obstruction case against her directly. Patty Osterman had never actually followed through on the request, and Robert made the judgment, one he later told me he made partly out of a professional mercy he was not required to extend, that pursuing my 71-year-old mother for a call that resulted in no actual action was not where the resources of his office needed to go. But the recording was used, devastatingly, at Kaylee's sentencing hearing in April, played aloud in the courtroom, my mother's voice asking a family friend to help make the witness less certain, 4 days after her daughter had left a man bleeding on the road. I was not in the courtroom that day. I want to be honest about that, because it would be a tidier story if I told you I sat quietly in the back row watching my sister sentenced by another judge while my family had no idea I was there. That is not what happened. I stayed away entirely, the way I had stayed away from every part of the proceeding, because my presence, even as a private citizen in the gallery, risked creating an appearance issue for a colleague's courtroom, and because I had, by that point, made my peace with watching this unfold from a distance, the same distance I had learned to keep my whole life, except now the distance was a professional obligation instead of a wound. Kaylee was sentenced to 18 months, with the possibility of early release after serving a portion at a minimum security federal facility, along with an order of restitution totaling $61,500 to cover Elias Gutierrez's initial medical expenses, with additional civil liability still pending separately at the time of the sentencing, a figure that would settle months later. At $187,400, once his ongoing rehabilitation costs and lost wages were fully calculated. The judge who sentenced her, a colleague of mine named Judge Patricia Alvarez, noted in her remarks, according to the transcript I later read alone in my chambers on a Sunday afternoon, that the defendant's initial flight from the scene was aggravated by evidence of an attempt, by a family member, to interfere with a witness, though that family member was not before the court. I read that transcript alone on a Sunday, 3 weeks after the sentencing, because I had waited that long before I let myself request it. And I want to describe what it was like to sit in my own chambers reading another judge's transcript of my sister's sentencing, in the same building where I hand down sentences of my own several times a month. Judge Alvarez had asked Kaylee, before pronouncing sentence, if she wished to address the court, and Kaylee had stood and read from a single sheet of paper, her voice, according to the court reporter's notation, breaking twice. And she said she was sorry, that she thought about Mr. Gutierrez every day, that she had been drinking that night because her second divorce had just been finalized that week, and she had not wanted to go home to an empty apartment. And that she understood no explanation, made it right that she had left him on the road instead of stopping. Elias Gutierrez had also submitted a victim impact statement, read aloud by the prosecutor because he had chosen not to attend in person, and in it he described, plainly, without embellishment, what it was like to relearn how to walk, to explain to his mother over a bad phone connection why he could not come home for a visit that year, to lie awake at night still hearing, he wrote, a sound like a car door closing too hard. I read his statement twice. I thought of Denise Ockhafer's testimony describing that same sound, two people who had never met each other, carrying the identical noise in their bodies from opposite ends of the same 5 seconds. Judge Alvarez's remarks at sentencing ran nearly 4 pages in the transcript, and she was, by all accounts, measured and fair, neither performing severity nor performing mercy, simply doing the plain arithmetic of the law the way I try to do it myself, and reading her words that Sunday afternoon, in my own chambers, with my father's pen sitting untouched in its tray, because I still could not bring myself to use it on anything connected to this case. I felt something I had not expected to feel, which was a kind of professional respect for a colleague handling my own family's wreckage with more composure than I might have managed had the case, by some twist of assignment, ever landed on my own docket. A possibility I was grateful, every day, had never come close to happening. My mother called me the night of the sentencing. Her voice on the phone was different than I had ever heard it, not managing, not performing, just small. She said, Diane, they played a recording of me on the phone with Patty. How did they even have that? And I sat in my kitchen, alone, Tom out with the boys at a basketball game, and I said nothing at first. And into that silence, my mother said, you would know about these things, wouldn't you, with your legal work? Could they really just listen to my phone calls like that? Something behind my sternum went tight in that moment, and it did not loosen for the rest of the call. I thought about all the ways I could answer that question honestly, and all the ways it would still not be honest enough. Because the full honest answer, the one I had been withholding for 6 years, was yes, Mom, they can, and I know exactly how, because I am the kind of judge who signs warrants like the one that caught you. I have signed dozens of them. I understand this system from the inside in a way you have never once asked me about. I said instead, warrants require probable cause, Mom. Someone had a reason to believe you might interfere with a witness. My mother was quiet for a moment, and then she said, I was only trying to help her. And I heard, underneath that sentence, the same woman who had sat me down at that kitchen table in July and asked her responsible daughter to lie to a federal investigation. Still, even now, unable to locate the actual center of what had happened, still orbiting Kaylee's need instead of Elias Gutierrez's fractured pelvis, still unable to say, even once, that what she had asked me to do that day had been wrong. I let the silence sit there. I did not fill it with reassurance. That was, I think, the hardest thing I did in this entire story, harder than refusing her request in July, because refusing a request happens once, in a moment, and you can brace yourself for it, but withholding comfort from your own mother's grief happens slowly, across a phone call that stretches on, across the specific temptation, every few seconds, to say something softening, something that would let her off the hook the way I had let her off the hook my entire life. I did not say it. I said, I have to go, Mom, and I hung up, and I sat at my kitchen table with the phone in my hand for a long time after that, and I did not cry, and I do not fully understand, even now, why I did not cry, except that I think some part of me had been grieving this particular version of my mother for so many years already that there was very little grief left to release in that specific moment. What was left, instead, was something closer to exhaustion, the particular exhaustion of finally setting down a weight you had carried so long you had forgotten it was optional. The night after the sentencing, once the boys were asleep, Tom found me sitting on the back porch in the dark without a jacket, even though it was late April and still cold enough at night that I could see my breath. He sat down next to me and did not say anything for a while, which is a thing I have always loved about him, that he knows the difference between a silence that needs filling and a silence that needs company. After a while, he asked what I was thinking about, and I told him about the owl in the attic, the wood carving from the county fair, a memory I had never once told him in 18 years of marriage. He listened to the whole thing without interrupting, and when I finished, he said, "You know you don't have to keep proving anything to her, Deanne. She already lost the chance to see you a long time ago. That's not something you owe her a second try at." I said, "I know that. And I do know it, intellectually, the way I know most legal principles, cleanly and from a distance. But knowing it and feeling it are two different rooms in the same house, and I told him I thought I needed to tell her anyway, not for her sake, but because I was tired of being the only person who knew the whole shape of my own life." He nodded and he took my hand, cold as it was, and he said, "Then write it down, you're good at that, and go to bed after. Don't sit out here till you catch a chill over your mother." I laughed, actually laughed, for the first time in weeks, and we went inside together. I want to tell you about the letter now, because this is the object this story has been circling since the beginning, and I promised myself, sitting in this chair tonight, that I would not leave it out the way I have left so many things out of conversations with my own family for 6 years. 2 weeks after the sentencing, I wrote my mother a letter. I did not call her. I did not go to the house on Kenwood Road. I sat in my chambers on a Sunday, the courthouse silent around me, and I took out my father's fountain pen, the black lacquer Waterman that has sat in a wooden tray on my desk since the day I was sworn in. The pen I write every important thing with, the pen that was on the kitchen table the day I got into law school, and I wrote her a letter by hand, 4 pages, and I told her, for the first time in 39 years, exactly what I do. I told her I am a United States District Judge for the Southern District of Ohio, appointed in 2018, confirmed by the Senate in 2019. I told her I had recused myself from every part of Kaylee's case, that I had never once used my position to help or to harm her, that I had let the process run exactly as it would have run for anyone else, because that is what the law requires, and because, I wrote, and this is the sentence I remember most clearly, because I have read it back to myself more times than I want to admit, that is also what Elias Gutierrez deserved. A system that did not bend for a family that had never once bent for me. I told her that I had not told her about my career for years, not because I was ashamed of her, but because I had learned, slowly, over decades, that anything I gave her that mattered to me became either invisible or became about Kaylee, and I had decided, at some point I could not even pinpoint, to stop offering things up that would only be diminished. I told her that in refusing, in July, to lie for Kaylee, I had not been protecting my career. I had been protecting the only thing I had ever built entirely on my own, without her attention, without her help, without her interference, which was my own integrity, and that I was not willing to trade it, not even for her, not even for Kaylee, because it was the one thing in my entire life that had never once required me to be small. I did not ask her to apologize in the letter. I did not ask her to change. I told her only that I loved her, which was true, in the complicated way it is true for daughters who have spent their whole lives loving mothers who never quite saw them, and that I would continue to be present in her life and in Kaylee's, but that I would not continue pretending to be someone with less than I have, because that pretending had cost me something I did not want to keep paying. I mailed the letter. I did not drive it over. I wanted her to be alone when she read it, the way I have been alone with almost everything that has mattered to me my whole life. I found out later, from my aunt in Dayton of all people, what my mother did in the hour after the mail arrived. She had been sitting on the front porch when the mail carrier came, according to my aunt, who my mother had called almost immediately afterward, still holding the pages. She read the letter standing at her own mailbox on Kenwood Road, the same mailbox I had walked past 10,000 times as a child, and my aunt said she stood there long enough that a neighbor across the street asked if she was all right. She did not answer the neighbor. She went inside, sat at the kitchen table, the same table where she had once asked me to lie for Kaylee, and read all 4 pages twice through before she called anyone at all. And then she called not me, but her sister in Dayton and cried for 20 minutes on the phone, and my aunt told me, months later over a different phone call entirely, that my mother had said, "Through the crying, I didn't know. I swear to you I didn't know. How did I not know my own daughter?" She called me 4 days later. She did not mention the letter directly at first. She talked about the weather, about a doctor's appointment, small, ordinary things, and I let her because I understood, by then, that this was as close as my mother would come to acknowledging what she had read, this careful circling, and near the end of the call, almost as an afterthought, in a voice smaller than I had ever heard her use, she said, "Diane, why didn't you ever tell me? I would have been proud of you." I did not answer that the way the old version of me would have, rushing to reassure her, to make her feel better about the years of silence. I said, "I don't know if that's true, Mom. I think you might have found a way to make it about something else. But I don't know for certain because I never gave you the chance, and I think now, looking back, that maybe I should have. I don't know. I'm still figuring that part out." She was quiet for a long moment, and then she said, "Okay," and that was all, and we hung up. And I do not know, even now, months later, whether anything between us has actually changed, whether my mother has become a different woman or has simply learned a new set of words to perform the same old orbit around Kaylee's needs. I do not know if Kaylee, who wrote me one letter from the federal facility in Kentucky where she is serving her sentence, a letter that said only, "I'm sorry, Diane. I should have called the ambulance. I think about him every day." I do not know if that letter means she has changed, or if it is simply what a person says from inside a cell when there is finally nothing left to manage. I wrote her back once, a short letter, shorter than the one I sent our mother, because I did not yet know what I wanted to say to my sister and did not want to write something false just to fill a page. I told her I was glad she was safe, that Ethan was doing fine, that Tom and the boys had taken him to a Reds game in August, and he had caught a foul ball, a detail I thought she would want more than any of the larger things I could have written. I told her I hoped she was using her time inside to think honestly about the night it happened, not about what it cost her, but about what it cost Elias Gutierrez, because I had come to believe, sitting with all of this for months, that the difference between those two kinds of thinking was the entire difference between a person who repeats a pattern and a person who finally breaks one. I did not tell her I forgave her. I did not know, when I sealed that envelope, whether I did, and I still do not know it fully now, though I think I am closer than I was in July. The facility she is at, a minimum security women's camp outside Lexington, Kentucky, allows visits on weekends with advance approval, and I have gone twice since the sentencing, both times without our mother, both times sitting across a plastic table in a visitation room painted the color of old bandages, and both times Kaylee has looked smaller than the sister I grew up with, not physically, though she has lost weight, but in some other way I do not have a precise word for. Deflated in the specific manner of a person who has finally run out of room to perform. On the second visit, in August, she asked me, out of nowhere, whether I remembered the county fair, the year she cried on the Ferris wheel, and I told her I did, and she said, "I don't remember much about that day except Dad buying me that elephant. Did anything else happen?" And I sat there for a moment deciding whether to tell her about the owl, about the blue ribbon, about the pocket, and in the end I told her, because it seemed, finally, like something worth handing to another person instead of keeping folded away in the dark. She was quiet for a long time after I finished, and then she said, "I didn't know that happened. I'm sorry, Diane," and I believed her, which surprised me, and I told her it was all right, which was not entirely true, but was closer to true than it had been in a long time. I want to tell you about Elias Gutierrez, because a story like this can too easily become only about the family that caused the harm, and I have tried, every day since July, not to let that happen in my own thinking, even privately. I do not know him. We have never met, and given the position I hold, we likely never will, but I read what became public in the civil filings the way I read everything, carefully, more than once. He is 31, from a town outside Antigua, Guatemala, and came to Cincinnati 8 years ago to work, first in construction, then in restaurants, sending money home every month to a mother who raised him and his 2 younger sisters largely alone. He was walking home the night of the accident because his own car, a 12-year-old Honda Civic, had failed inspection the week before, and he had not yet saved enough to fix it. A detail that sat with me for a long time after I read it. The particular cruelty of a man being struck down on the one night he had no choice but to walk. What I know is this. Elias Gutierrez, I have learned through the civil settlement records, which are public, is walking again, with a cane, slowly, and has returned to work in a modified role at a different restaurant closer to his apartment, and receives, as part of the settlement, $187,400. A sum that will never fully account for a fractured skull, or a shattered pelvis, or the 6 weeks he spent unable to work, while his mother in Guatemala called every day not understanding why her son would not answer. What I know is that my father's pen still sits in the wooden tray on my desk, and that I write every sentencing order with it now, every single one, and that when I signed the recusal paperwork on Kaylee's case back in the summer, I used a different pen entirely, a plain courthouse ballpoint, because some part of me, even then, before I understood why, could not bring myself to let my father's pen touch that particular piece of paper. Last month, my mother asked, for the first time in her life, if she could sit in on one of my hearings, a scheduling conference, nothing dramatic, but a real proceeding in a real courtroom with my name on the door. I told her yes. She sat in the 3rd row of the gallery in a blue cardigan, and afterward in the hallway outside my courtroom, she did not say very much. She is not a woman built for large declarations, but she reached out and touched the sleeve of my robe before I could take it off. Just for a second, the fabric between her fingers, and she said, "This is really yours, isn't it?" And I said, "Yes, Mom, it is," and that was the whole conversation, and it was, somehow, more than I had gotten from her in 46 years combined. I do not know if that moment in the hallway means the door behind my sternum, the one that closed at her kitchen table in July, will ever fully open again. I am not sure I want it to open the same way it used to, wide and unguarded and waiting for her approval like weather I could not control. But I have noticed, these past few weeks, that it is no longer locked. It simply sits there, closed most days, and every so often, on its own schedule, not hers, it opens a crack, the way it did in that hallway, and I let it. And then I close it again, gently, and go on with my life, which is, I have come to understand, the most honest kind of relationship I am able to offer her right now, and possibly the most honest one she has ever actually earned. I am sitting here tonight, in my chambers, with the coffee gone cold and the river outside going dark, and I am thinking about the woman who sat at that kitchen table in July and asked her responsible daughter to disappear one more time, to take one more fall so that everyone else could stay exactly as they were. I did not disappear. I want that to be the last thing I say to you, because it is the only part of this whole story I am completely certain of. For 46 years, I made myself smaller so that my family's story could stay simple. I am not doing that anymore. I do not know what my mother and I will become to each other from here, but I know my own name now, in a way I did not before, and I know what I am willing to sign my name to, and what I am not, and I intend to keep it that way for whatever years I have left. I picked my father's pen up off the tray a moment ago, before I started speaking to you tonight, just to hold it, the way he held it, the way I have held it every day for 6 years without ever once telling anyone why it mattered so much, and I am putting it back down now, gently, exactly where it belongs, because some things I have finally learned do not need to be explained to be understood. They only need to be kept. You have reached the end of the text.